Hey everybody, welcome to YouTube's Scale Modeling channel. This evening we're going to start a two-part series on airbrushing. Over the past few months I've gotten a lot of emails from people asking me how I do my airbrushing. So what we're going to do is we'll start at my airbrushing station. I'm going to show you how I have everything organized. Then we'll move on to parts prep, and then I'm going to show you how I do my paint mixing. I'm an enamel guy, and so I still like using Testor's enamel paints. And yeah, they're only available in the quarter-ounce bottles, but you know what? They go on really, really well. And I'm going to show you how I mix Humbrol enamel paints. In part 2, I'm going to show you the actual techniques that I use for airbrushing, how I move my arm, my wrist, and how I rotate the parts. And then finally, I'm going to show you a very important step: cleaning your airbrush, which you should do after every session. I talk to a lot of modelers who are having problems with their airbrush, and the first thing I ask them is, let me see your airbrush. And in most cases, it's gunked up with paint because they don't clean it. So you should do that after every session. And we'll talk about this some more in part 2. So with all of that said, let's get started. I exhaust the fumes and the paint particles via a 42-inch standard over-the-oven exhaust fan system. This one is a 42-inch Braun, and I have an 8-inch flexible tube which vents to the outside. On the left side you can see the plywood board that I modified and cut to shape so that it fits inside the window frame. So all I need to do is open the window, I insert that wood frame into the frame of the window and then close the window, and it provides a very secure exhaust system for me. In addition, you want to have really good lighting. So I use 2 desk lamps in addition to the 2 light bulbs that are on the underside of this Braun exhaust system. In my airbrushing station, let's start on the right-hand side. Because I'm right-handed, all of the airbrush supplies and the paints that I use are on the right-hand side. I have my different jars that I use when I'm doing multiple color sessions, and all the different size Q-tips that I use for cleaning the airbrush between multiple color sessions, as well as cleaning the airbrush when I'm done. I also keep all the mixed paint on the right-hand side properly labeled, and the original paint jars, and my copper-colored BBs that I use to mix the original paint. And when I'm done, I pour thinner from that glass jar into that tan bowl underneath and soak the airbrush after it's been taken apart, let it sit for about 2 or 3 hours, clean all the parts, put it all back together, and I'm ready for my next airbrushing session. In the center of my airbrush station, up against the back wall, I keep 2 sections of foam board that I use to test the paint when I'm airbrushing before I apply that paint to the surface of the model. This works really, really well for me, and I also use it to get rid of any excess paint that is in the airbrush prior to using a different color or when I'm done airbrushing during a session. On the left side of my airbrushing station, I keep my supply of Q-tips and a box of tissues. I usually go through 2 boxes of tissues for every project, my coffee cup warmer that I use to warm the paint before I airbrush, and all the different thinners that I use. I took a quantum leap forward in my airbrushing results when I switched from a standard compressor to a CO2 container. This is about the size of a scuba tank, and it has a pressure regulator on top that allows me to adjust the pressure from 0 to a much larger amount, and it really works well for me. It's silent, and most importantly, the air is very dry, so you never have to worry about water spitting onto the surface of your model like you do with an air compressor. I highly recommend that if you're using an air compressor, you switch to a CO2 tank. Here's a close-up of the pressure regulator that I use for my CO2 tank. The right dial tells me how much pressure is in the tank, and the left dial tells me how much pressure is actually coming out of the hose. And that black dial allows me to adjust the pressure to any PSI I need. To the left of my airbrushing station are the storage containers that are on rollers that I use to store airbrush parts, airbrush supplies, and all of my weathering supplies. This works really, really well for me because it allows me to roll these different containers around where I need them. If you don't have a dedicated airbrushing station, you can actually use your kitchen stove, and here is how you set it up. You can make a simple paint booth by using a sturdy cardboard box. Just cut out the front and the top, and you have a paint booth. Just be sure it fits between the exhaust fan at the top of your stove and on the surface of your stove. Also, be sure your burners are off. Otherwise, you're going to cause a fire and really make your wife mad. This simple paint booth works best with an exhaust fan that pushes the air outside of your house. Recirculating fans don't work as well for this process. The other thing you need to do for this simplified paint booth is to put an HVAC filter taped to the top front of the exhaust fan. Otherwise, paint fumes as well as paint particles are going to get stuck to the top and ruin the appearance of your exhaust fan above the stove. Now, let's move on to parts preparation and then finally to paint mixing. This is how I have all of my parts set up for airbrushing, and I've done it this way for a long time, about 30 years, and it works great. Larger parts get taped to sections of foam board, and the smaller parts I use small sections of balsa wood. And again, I just take the masking tape and fold it over on itself and mix a perfect sticky surface onto either the styrofoam or the balsa wood. Here's the small parts, and you can see I use liberal amounts of tape to ensure that everything is secured to the balsa wood or the foam board, because what you don't want to do is have it blow off while you're airbrushing it. So it needs to be secure to the surface that you've taped it to. And you'll notice on the parts that are attached to the balsa wood strips, there's an end that's free, and that's the end I will hold the balsa wood strip so that I can manipulate both the balsa wood strip and the airbrush to make sure that all the little nicks and crannies and the tight areas on these small parts all receive a coat of paint. Foam board works really good for large sections like fuselage halves and wings. And it's also important, and I'll do this just before I start airbrushing, I'll take high pressure air from my airbrush and blow off all the parts to make sure that to the greatest extent possible there's no dust on the surfaces. And you're going to get some dust on your model no matter what you do. But what you want to do is minimize the dust bunnies wherever possible. Here again, foam board is really good for large sub-assemblies like wings. And the masking tape on the end there is to prevent paint from getting on to the positioning pins that are on the inside area of the wings that will hold everything in place and position it correctly. And Monogram always did a really good job of that. So here's the other wing, and here again the tape that covers the stems just keeps the paint from getting on it, so I don't have to scrape it off later on, which always creates a mess. And so the other nice thing about these large sections of foam board is you can turn them and move them as you need to, in combination with using your wrist to move the airbrush around to get around curved and compound surfaces. So that's another good reason to use these large sections of foam board. The other thing I didn't mention was I cleaned all these parts as best I could with alcohol and either tissue or cotton balls to get as much of the oil off of them from my skin from handling it. So I try to do everything I can to make sure I have a clean surface for the first coat of paint so that I don't have any issues associated with the paint pulling up, which it'll do. If you have a dirty surface and it's got skin oils on it, you stand a good chance of having your paint peel up on you. So you want to take every precaution necessary. So once these are set up, other than hitting them with high pressure air to try to remove as much dust as possible, I don't touch these parts until I have them painted, and then of course you got to flip them over and do the other side. So there you have it. That's how I set things up. Hey everybody. In this segment, I'm going to show you how I do my airbrush mixing. And right now I've got 2 bottles of Tester's paint. I've got the manufacturer's thinner. I've got 2 airbrush jars labeled, one for the paint and one here for the airbrush mixing, which is for the thinner. And I have my eyedroppers and my trusty tweezers. And well, actually I've got 2 different types of eyedroppers, but I use this one mostly. So the first step that I always do is you want to get the paint mixed really, really well inside of its container. So what I do on every type of paint is I use these copper covered BBs. And these can be found just about anywhere. You want copper colored so that they will not change the shade or tint of your paint. Steel ones tend to do that, but the copper colored ones do not. So in these small jugs I put just 2 copper BBs, sometimes 3. And we got to shake them up really, really good so that all of the thicker paint that usually sits at the bottom will get mixed with the other parts of the paint. And when we're done, we're going to go ahead and we're going to pour it both into here. And then once we get that leveled out, then we'll put some thinner in here. And I usually use about 1/3 thinner to 2 parts paint. But I don't know, I'll show you what that means in just a minute here. So the Testors paints are really easy to use because they've got these simple jars. I'm going to show you how to do Humbrol's next, and they're a little bit more of a challenge. But this process that I'm going to show you, I have used for many, many years, and it has never failed me. We want to pour the paint in, and we'll go ahead and clean this tip here on this paint, although it'll get thrown away. But what we want, of course, is we'll add a few drops of thinner here, and to this one, I just love this color. Okay. Wasn't necessary to put all of this second one in. I want to have some unthinned paint on hand just in case I over thin it. So now when you fill that up with thinner, it's going to go to about here. So let's go ahead and get this. We want to put this one on the side, and we'll get this one here. And again, you always want to use the paint manufacturer's thinner, especially Humbrol paints. You have to use Humbrol thinner with Humbrol paints. There we go. We'll go ahead and go ahead and shake that up real good. Now, sometimes the BBs I added will kind of drop in there, but in this case we'll go ahead and pull them out if I can find the second one. Here it is, and get the rest of this paint in here. And there's always the goo on the bottom. And now the other thing is you always want to have a good supply of tissues on hand, and I go through a lot of tissues, just like I go through a lot of masking tape. I'll go ahead and clean these real good. I'll clean these in thinner before I go back to when I show you how to do Humbrol enamel paints, and this is their primer, and we'll do that next. So this is the airbrush mixing jar, and for the Humbrol thinner I have this labeled as Humbrol thinner so that I don't mix the two up. Now we will go ahead and put I want about 1/3 of the thinner to this length here, and it's just, of course, there's no precise way to measure this. You can just eye it and pretty much get it the way you want. Okay, that's about a third. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and I like my paints a little on the thick side when I start, and the reason is it gives you some flexibility and latitude to thin it out a little. The other thing is I'm using these Badger mixing jars, and every time I start a new project, I take out these old lids when I clean the jars and I put new lids in, and that's because paint can get underneath these seals and then it ruins your color. So I always replace the seals, and this is just automotive gasket material that I cut with an old circular drafting template, and I keep a good supply of them on hand. And now we can go ahead and we'll mix this up, and we'll see how it feels. We'll see how it looks. Let's see. I like give it about 10 seconds, and if the paint doesn't thin out on the sides, I'll thin it out a little bit more, and there we go. I think we've got just, I think I'll just add just a tad bit more to this, and there's no exact science to it, and that should do it just fine. When you go to airbrush, that's when you really know, but my experience has taught me that when the thinner, sounds like I've got a copper BB in here, but I don't think so. All right, let that sit for a minute, and yeah, I think we're good. So when I go ahead and test the paint, another thing you always want to do is test your paint on a scrap surface. And here what I'm doing is I'm cleaning this cap really, really good to get a really good seal. So that's my interior color, and I'm going to use it for my 1/48 scale Revell Monogram B24D build. I like this color, and I like this Chromate green too, but I like this color. My next project after the B24 will be the Revell Monogram PBY, and I'll go back to Chromate green, but for now I'm going to use this color. So I'm going to go ahead and get us set up for Humbrol, which is a little bit more of a challenge because you got to use a screwdriver to pop off these tins and pop them back on with some BBs in here to get this shaken up real well. So with that, we'll put this on the side, and we'll go ahead and get set up with the Humbrol paints, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so I already put 2 copper BBs in this one, and I use a small screwdriver to open up these Humbrol tins, and it works really, really well. And we'll go ahead and we'll drop 2 BBs in here, and we'll go ahead and close this lid, and then we'll go ahead and shake these puppies up a little bit, and we'll see how it comes out. Yes, my skin tone looks a little bit funny because I've got everything focused right in this area right here. So let's see how that goes. And I think we're ready. We'll see how it goes. These tins are, they're okay, but pouring it out, you always lose some. And we'll go ahead and clean this up a little bit. Clean this up. We'll go ahead and put a little bit of Humbrol thinner in here. And close this lid up. And we'll go ahead and shake it up some more. That's the thing about these lids. You get, a lot of times you get paint all over the place. And but we'll work with it. Okay, we'll go ahead and pop this tin off, and we'll go ahead and find the, see, you get all that goo on the bottom, and that'll clog up your airbrush, but that's a good reason to go ahead and, let's see here. Sometimes it can be really, really hard to find what you're looking for. All right, I can't find it, so we'll just go ahead and pour in here what we got. All right, I'm going to discard this one because we're not going to use it anymore. And this second one, we need to get a little more paint in here for priming. Otherwise, we're not going to have enough primer. I really like Humbrol primer because it acts like real primer. All right. That should be more than enough. And of course, we're going to lose all this primer up here, but it's important to go ahead and clean these caps. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to lose a seal. We don't want that. All right, the seal is nice and clean, and we'll go ahead and pop that in place. All right, here we've got our primer, and I'm going to go ahead and measure out some Humbrol thinner here. I think we need a little more. Yep, just a hair. All right, I think we got it. So we're going to go ahead and pour this in, and then we'll mix this up. But first, you always want to seal these caps, and go ahead and soak up the rest of this Humbrol thinner. And I'm going to go ahead and, this is my cleaning jar. I'm going to go ahead and clean these tweezers. And get them out of the way. Put that over there. Get this out of the way, and the BB's out of the way. And let's go ahead and mix this up. And let's see what we got. Looks good. We'll see how it airbrushes. If it's too thin, I can always thicken it up. So, and because I've got so much here, I may have to pour out some of this out into a second container and thin it up, or thicken it up. So, but for now, until we test it, we'll go ahead and pull it off to the side. And so that's how I mix my paints. And I'm an enamel guy. I've tried acrylic paints, and the problem with acrylics is they tend to pull up when you mask. And I do a lot of masking. If you want to use acrylics on the interior of an aircraft because you're not going to be doing any masking, then use acrylics. But I'm an enamel guy, and I really like using enamel paints. So that concludes this segment on paint mixing, and this process that I've showed you I've used for over 30 years, and I never deviate from it, and it has never failed me. So with that, have a great evening, and we'll move on to the next segment of our series of videos on airbrushing. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of our 2-part series on airbrushing. And again, in part 2, I'm going to show you the actual techniques that I use in the movement of my arm and my wrist and the rotation of the parts to get a good surface paint coverage on all of the parts. So with that said, have a great evening, happy scale modeling, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and visit us at www.mikeashley.com.